I'm kind of embarrassed to talk about how many years I've gone to CES in a row. It's like in the decades at this point. And, 10 years ago when you went to CES, like the cool thing that people were buzzing about was maybe like a new streaming device, like DVR. 5 years ago was maybe like a drone. The drones started to kind of creep out, or like 3D food printing. But I went to CES this year, and like all the buzz was about a bread making machine. Did anyone go to CES and check out the bread bot? Yeah, so some of the folks were there, which was unusual. I have a couple theories why it was so hot. A, bread smells delicious, and like I don't know if you're pumping the smell out, but also people just love to see things being made in front of them. Why do you think you guys were such a buzz and such a hit at CES?
Well, the interesting thing is that bread as a category in supermarkets has been for years a stagnant or even declining category. And so for a small company like us to go to the big, sexy Consumer Electronics Show, the most that we really came in expecting was to make some good industry contacts. Certainly didn't anticipate hitting the big time. But what was interesting is we get to CES and this thing just went viral. I mean, CNN, ABC, CBS, Today's Show, Trevor Noah Daily Show did a riff on it. And that explosive response, and we were also finalists for Best of Show. Why did that happen? And I have a theory. My theory is that it's not that we've given up on bread, but the current incarnation of bread has just not been exciting. I mean, you come into the center of the store and bread is just kind of that cold bag up there that maybe was 2 days ago, maybe 7 days. When was it baked? But the promise of being able to go into a store or to a location and take bread fresh out of the oven that you've seen come out of that oven was apparently very exciting to people around the world. Actually, I mean, the global response has been amazing.
This idea of making bread in point of presence runs counter to, I think, what we've seen over the past century, right? I mean, the grand trend over the past century has been centralization of food production. And so I think it's interesting that you're trying to reverse that. And it kind of fits into a grand theory I have that, like, with robotics or digital technology, we're starting to push intelligence to the edges with micromanufacturing. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that kind of one of the reasons you started BreadBot? Are you seeing a similar trend?
Yeah, we think that the Industrial Revolution, obviously, because of the strengths of centralized production, made efficiency paramount. And so the ability of all of that power at the center made life much easier for us because of that efficiency. But as time has passed, there has been a trend to move that production back out to the edges, whether it's no longer needing the printing press. We've got 3D, we've got inkjet printers, we've got the kinds of things that make production possible out at the edge. In the case of bread has been for a century undisrupted as a centralized function, because in order to produce, you need a lot of different skill sets. You need a lot of brain power from master bakers, from supervisors, analysts, technical people, food safety, all of these different contributions being synchronized. You can't take those people and set them up efficiently in thousands of towns around the country, so you centralize. But what's happening today is that you can take that brain power and you can put it on a chip and you can miniaturize the factory, and now you can move that out to the edge and have the production at the edge. And for things like food that are preferred fresh, centralized production has always been a problem, because when you have centralized production, there's a time delay and a cost to getting that food to the perimeter, and it implies preservatives, it implies cost of distribution. And so this ability now to bring all of that to the edge is making, I think, a big difference.
And I think it aligns well with like macro food trends, right? People want fresh They want local. They want food transparency, and there's nothing more transparent than the food being made in front of you. But I still think there's cost efficiencies to centralized production. Although we talked a little bit about this, and you kind of, I think, would counter, or you tell me, you can wring costs out of what is a fairly inefficient logistics supply chain, right? So if you look at like the getting stuff on trains, shipping it out from like a factory in Chicago, that's not exactly cheap as well. So talk a little bit about that. Have you kind of studied that, and kind of how would a bread bot be from a running a cost perspective versus like centralized?
Yeah, that I wish I could say that we had started with this knowledge and started the project based on this recognition. It's really been the reverse, that we started the project and have grown to understand it as we've gone. But I think it's an important concept for us as we're working in the area of automating food. And that comes down to, I think, if you analyze the value chain of the particular food that you're involved in our case, it's bread, and if you start taking, if you take a $3.99 loaf of bread and you say, what are the contributions to that value chain from the farmer and the land and the labor and the fertilizer and the transportation and the miller, all of the commodity costs, all of the production costs, the cost of the plant, the cost of the labor, the cost of the equipment, all of that production cost, and then you look at the labor that it takes. If you've got a factory with 100,000 loaves coming off of the shelf, out of the oven, and you need to get that to the shelf in 1,000 different stores, that process is a very expensive process because of the labor, the 60 or 80 or however many different SKUs that you have that you're trying to distribute. That process is a slow and expensive process, and so you've got labor, you've got fleet, you've got fuel, you've got all of those things, and then you get to the retailer, you've got marketing expenses, you've got the plant expenses, and you've got labor. So when you have this entire supply chain, the question is, what is my contribution to that supply chain? What am I making more efficient in that supply chain? Many of the contributions being made are in the labor reduction, which is significant, but in our case, the actual offset that we're looking at is all of the plant and equipment costs of the factory, all of the labor costs of the factory, all of the fleet, all of the fuel, all of the distribution costs. And when you have a value proposition that addresses as many slices of that value chain as you can, I think it strengthens the case for the automation that we're working on.
So you guys do have some robots in test locations, I think largely in Eastern Washington, Spokane area. By the way, I'm so proud of my home state that you have a robot out in Spokane, Eastern Washington. I wasn't expecting that. And you guys have made a choice to kind of put your robot in front of the consumer, right? So like most bread production is done, if it's done in a factory, you're not seeing it, but obviously if they're baking in the bakery at the grocery store, you're not seeing it. Talk about some of the lessons you've learned and why you've kind of made this choice to actually put this out in the middle of the grocery store aisle.
One of the interesting things, there's a conference coming up that has done a lot of research into bakery industry, and one of the things that they're learning is how important it is for the consumer to have transparency in the process. And so for us, the ability to provide that transparency, it's no longer a question to the consumer, how old is this bread? I know how old this bread is. I saw it being baked myself. There's that component, but there's another component that I think is also very interesting, and that is the engagement with my food. I mean, most kids today, and many of our generation never have seen bread being baked. My mom baked bread, and I learned what that was. I had the pleasure of that aroma. But a lot of kids have no idea this thing we call bread, where did it come from? And in the case of the bread bot in stores, kids come flocking to it. A year or 2 years later, they're still coming. When Mom comes in, Mom, okay, you can watch the bread bot. I'll go do the shopping. This engagement of watching our food being created, that participation, I think, is a significant component.
I am going to go to the audience for questions, so think of them. But real quickly, talk a little bit about this idea of. I think it'd be interesting to the audience to hear how like it operates within a grocery store context. Like, so is someone show up at 4 a.m. and load the dough in, and do you have like one person managing it all day? Talk a little bit about how you see it being optimized in in a kind of a situation within a grocery store.
Actually, what happens is that the process started the end of the day before. About a half hour of cleaning, a lot of it self-cleaning, but at that point, the ingredients for the following day are loaded into the large hopper, and the program has been set either for the month or adjusted at this point in time. On the pad, the bakery says, here's what our production plan for tomorrow is. And depending on what the plan is, at 3 in the morning, it will wake itself up and do the warming of the oven and then start the baking of the bread. And when people arrive, there's already baked bread ready to go. And so it is its own self-maintaining employee of the store. Through the day, it takes care of itself. The consumer comes and touches the pad and says, okay, I want a warm loaf or I want a cooled loaf. Consumer can take that loaf, go over to we don't make it, but a commercial bread slicing unit that you set your bread in, close the top, say I want a thin, medium, or thick sliced loaf, and it'll slice it, put it in, and away they go. So in terms of what it takes for the store to operate it, very little, and that's kind of the day. The hopper is about 90 loaves of production. There's 10 loaves coming out each hour, one every 6 minutes, and so that represents well into a day of bread production.
Bread baking. Any questions for Randall? Right there.
This is the same question from the last panel, scaling up. How are you able to scale up?
For production of the units, we've had a small subsidiary in China for the last 10 years as we've been developing the unit, so that the production is actually already, virtually all of our components right now have been spec'd and pre-produced already, where the last 10% of the items are just now being locked down. So we're in production, and scaling that production is it's always a challenge, but we're pretty well set to begin that process.
Yeah, I'm curious if you're finding any challenges with the variability in product just due to it's from Mother Nature and it varies season to season. And how does that baker on a chip address it?
Yeah, that's why, as it turns out, we've had the misfortune or good fortune of tackling a problem that had never been solved before, and that is what you're addressing is that baking bread is orchestrating this biological organism, yeast, and the foodstuff that is very variable. And a master baker is one who's able to take that, tell from the dough, not quite right, sprinkle a little more flour on it, yeah, okay, that's right. But today I'm going to need to turn the oven up just a little bit. This nuance, bread doesn't come from, okay, I open the book, here's what the recipe is, and I make a master loaf of bread just by following the rules in that book. What it's taken, what we've learned is this process of, as the bread is being produced, we're constantly monitoring a variety of sensors and a variety of characteristics, identifying that, okay, no, for this yeast, it must not have been well stored. It must be underpowered, so we're going to increase by 2 grams each loaf of bread how much yeast, decrease the water. It's a continually recursive adjustment to the process so that we're able to keep that consistent loaf coming out. And so, yes, that orchestration has been a very challenging thing, but we get wonderful, consistent bread quality because of that ability now.
A couple questions back there, Chris.
How do you deal with a customer who orders your bread, steps away to go grab something else on the shelf, and then goes and grabs 5 other things while your bread's not out, and there's other people in line? Repeat the question. The question is, how do we deal with someone who's ordered the bread, then leaves, and it's there? The cabinet that dispenses the bread is protected. Person touches it and it brings it to a window. If no one has reached into that window, there's a sensor that tells if that curtain has been pierced. And if it hasn't been, in 15 seconds, it's returned and it's on to the next person. If it has been pierced and someone has touched the loaf but has not taken the loaf, it's tagged and put aside for the bakery to do whatever their protocol is with a touched loaf. But so it doesn't tie up time or keep other customers from using it.
Yes, sir. What are your customers' feedback on the different business models? For example, buying the hardware from you, having a service contract, or having you manage the entire supply chain?
Yes, the challenge for us is that this is a very recognizable unit. So someone coming to store A and getting the bread says, okay, this came from a bread bot. If the quality is poor, if it's been poorly maintained and it's cardboard for bread, they're saying, I'm never buying it again. And they go to store B that makes wonderful bread, but it's been ruined for store B by store A. The only way to deal with that is where we have not sold it, but rather leased it, and we control the brand by having requirements with that lease. So it's a lease model where there are certain standards that are required, and so it's based on a lease model.
Well, we're out of time. You owe this gentleman an answer because I told him we'd go to him, so maybe off stage. But to keep the trains running on time, we want to thank you, Randall. Give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
And, yeah, appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks.